The endless stretch of asphalt shimmered under the weak light of the full moon. Interstate 67 was notorious among truckers and night travelers, whispered about at diners and gas stations. No one could quite agree on why the highway felt wrong, but everyone had a story. A wrong turn that led to nowhere, a hitchhiker who vanished, or the unsettling feeling of being watched. For Tom Burrows, a seasoned trucker, those tales were just that, tales. He had spent 15 years hauling cargo across the country, laughing off ghost stories shared by fellow drivers. Tonight was no different. He was on a tight schedule carrying a load of electronics to Dallas and had decided to take the infamous Interstate 67 for the shortcut it offered. The road was desolate and his headlights barely cut through the dense fog rolling in. Tom glanced at the clock on his dashboard. 2:12 a.m. A deep yawn escaped him as he reached for his thermos. The bitter coffee did little to settle his nerves as the radio crackled and popped. He twisted the knob, but all he got was static. Strange. He could usually pick up a station or two, even in remote areas. Ahead, a faint figure materialized in the fog. A hitchhiker. Tom slowed his rig, squinting through the windshield. A young woman, wearing a threadbare jacket and jeans, stood by the side of the road. Her thumbs stuck out stiffly, her face obscured by the shadows. Against his better judgment, Tom pulled over. "You okay, miss?" he asked through the open passenger window. She didn't answer immediately, just stared at him with wide, vacant eyes. Finally, she nodded and climbed into the cab. "Thanks," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Tom nodded and pulled back onto the highway. She was young, barely in her 20s, and pale as if she hadn't seen sunlight in years. Her hands trembled as she clutched her knees. "Where you headed?" Tom asked, trying to break the uncomfortable silence. "Just down the road," she said, her voice distant. Tom frowned. Something about her seemed off. Her clothes were oddly outdated, her hair matted as though she'd been on the run. He decided not to press her. The miles stretched on in silence, the hum of the engine the only sound. Tom couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He glanced at the woman out of the corner of his eye, only to find her staring directly at him, unblinking. You shouldn't have stopped," she whispered suddenly. Tom felt a chill crawl up his spine. "What do you mean?" "They don't like it when people stop," she said, her voice cracking. Tom laughed nervously, trying to shake off the growing unease. "Who doesn't like it?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned her gaze to the foggy road ahead. A shadow darted across the highway, too fast to be an animal. Tom slammed on the brakes, his rig screeching to a halt. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, his heart pounding. The woman didn't react, just stared blankly out the windshield. Tom leaned forward, scanning the fog for any sign of movement. The shadow reappeared, closer this time. It was humanoid but wrong, its limbs too long, its gait unnatural. Tom's breath caught in his throat. "Stay here," he told the woman, grabbing his flashlight and stepping out of the truck. The cold night air bit at his skin as he shone the beam into the fog. The light caught on something, a glint of eyes, too high off the ground to belong to any normal creature. "Hey!" Tom called, his voice trembling. "Who's there?" No response, just the faint sound of breathing, deep and ragged. Tom backed toward his truck, every instinct screaming at him to run. As he reached the door, he noticed the woman was gone. "Miss?" he called, panic rising. He swung the flashlight around, but she was nowhere to be seen. A low growl echoed through the fog, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Tom scrambled into the cab and locked the doors. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, and started the engine. The shadow loomed in front of the truck, blocking his path. It stood still, its head cocked at an unnatural angle, watching him. Tom floored the accelerator. The rig roared forward, and the shadow disappeared beneath the wheels. He didn't stop to check. He didn't care what it was. He just wanted to get the hell off that highway. Hours later, as dawn broke, Tom pulled into a rest stop, his hands still trembling. He stepped out of the cab, needing fresh air to clear his mind. "Rough night?" a voice asked. Tom turned to see an older man sitting on a bench, sipping coffee. "You could say that," Tom replied, lighting a cigarette. "You take 67? the man asked, his tone serious. Tom nodded. The man shook his head. "Shouldn't have done that. Strange things happen on that road." Tom frowned. "Like what?" The man leaned forward, his eyes dark. "Folks disappear. Things follow you. They say if you pick someone up, you're marked." Tom froze, his blood running cold. "And if you see a shadow in the fog," the man continued, "you'd best keep driving." Tom glanced back at his truck. The passenger seat was empty, but a faint handprint smeared with blood was etched into the glass. The night was unnaturally quiet as Lisa drove along Highway 91, a desolate stretch of road infamous for its eerie reputation. She wasn't one to buy into ghost stories, but tonight she felt an inexplicable tension in the air. Her car's dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m., and she still had miles to go before reaching her cousin's house in the next town. The highway stretched ahead like a dark, unending ribbon, flanked by dense woods on either side. She hadn't passed another car in over an hour. As she reached for her water bottle, her headlights caught a figure standing by the roadside. It was a man, dressed in a tattered gray suit, his face partially obscured by shadows. He wasn't hitchhiking or signaling for help. He simply stood there, staring at her car with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Lisa pressed down on the gas pedal, speeding past him. Her pulse quickened. She glanced in the rearview mirror, but he was gone. There hadn't been anywhere for him to disappear to. No turnoffs, no cover other than the woods. She shook her head, chalking it up to her imagination. Minutes later, her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Lisa picked it up, frowning. The screen displayed an unknown number. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Hello?" Static crackled on the line, followed by a faint whisper. "Don't stop," the voice said. Her grip tightened on the wheel. "Who is this?" The line went dead. Lisa's heart raced as she tossed the phone aside. The road seemed darker now, the fog denser. She tried to focus on the asphalt ahead, but her eyes kept darting to the woods, half expecting to see the man again. A loud thud jolted her from her thoughts. Her car jerked violently to the side, and she fought to keep it on the road. The engine sputtered, and the car rolled to a stop. "No, no," she muttered, slamming her hands against the steering wheel. She stepped out, her phone's flashlight cutting through the thick fog. Her tires were intact, but something sticky and black coated the hood of her car. It smelled foul, like rotting meat. She gagged, covering her nose. The woods around her seemed to close in, the shadows shifting as though alive. The air felt heavier, almost oppressive. And then she heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the trees. Lisa froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The growl grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of leaves and twigs. She backed toward her car, her breathing shallow. A figure emerged from the fog. It was the man in the gray suit, but his face was wrong. His skin was pale and stretched too tightly over his skull, and his eyes were empty sockets that oozed black liquid. He smiled, a grotesque, toothy grin, and raised a bony hand to point at her. Lisa screamed, scrambling into her car and locking the doors. She fumbled with the ignition, her hands slick with sweat. The engine sputtered to life, and she floored the gas pedal. The man didn't move, but as she sped away, he raised his hand and waved. The car roared down the highway, the fog swallowing the road. Lisa's hands trembled on the wheel, her mind racing. She glanced in the rearview mirror, but there was no sign of him. Just as she began to calm down, her phone buzzed again. She ignored it, focusing on the road ahead. The buzzing stopped, replaced by the car's radio flickering to life. Static filled the cabin, and then a familiar voice spoke. "You can't outrun it." Lisa's blood ran cold. It was her own voice. The headlights dimmed, and the car slowed, no matter how hard she pressed the gas. The fog thickened, and dark shapes moved within it, circling her car like predators. The man appeared again, standing in the middle of the road. This time he wasn't alone. Figures emerged from the woods, their forms twisted and unnatural, their hollow eyes fixed on her. Lisa slammed on the brakes, but the car kept moving, drawn toward the man like a magnet. Her screams echoed into the night as the fog consumed her. The next morning, Highway 91 was quiet, bathed in the pale light of dawn. A state trooper found Lisa's car parked neatly on the shoulder. The doors were unlocked, the keys still in the ignition, but Lisa was nowhere to be found. Inside the car, etched into the fogged-up windshield, were 3 words: "You should have listened." The rain came down in relentless sheets, drumming against the roof of Mark's car as he sped down the narrow highway. It was supposed to be a quick trip, just him and his dog, Charlie, heading home after visiting his parents. But the storm had turned the familiar road into a treacherous, winding nightmare. Charlie, a large German shepherd, sat in the back seat, his ears perked and his nose twitching. Normally calm, the dog had been restless for the past hour, whining softly and occasionally growling at nothing. "Relax, buddy," Mark said, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. "We'll be home soon." The words felt hollow. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly. the forest on either side dark and impenetrable. The headlights barely pierced the rain, and the radio was nothing but static. Then he saw it, a flicker of movement on the side of the road. At first, Mark thought it was an animal, but as he got closer, the shape became clearer. A woman stood there drenched, her long hair plastered to her face. She wore a thin white dress that clung to her body, utterly unsuitable for the weather. She wasn't waving for help or trying to flag him down. She just stood still, staring at his car as it approached. Mark's instincts screamed at him to keep driving, but guilt gnawed at him. What if she was hurt or stranded? Against his better judgment, he pulled over. The woman approached the passenger side window, moving unnaturally fast for someone soaking wet. Mark rolled the window down slightly. "Are you okay? Do you need a ride?" She nodded, but said nothing. Her eyes were unnervingly wide, and her lips trembled as though she wanted to speak, but couldn't. Mark unlocked the door, and she slid into the passenger seat without a word. Her presence chilled the air, and the smell of rain and earth filled the car. "Where are you headed?" he asked, trying to sound casual. She turned to him, her expression blank. "Ahead," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. Charlie let out a low growl from the back seat, his hackles raised. Mark frowned. Charlie never acted like this around strangers. "Sorry about him," Mark said, glancing at the woman. She didn't react, her gaze fixed straight ahead. The car felt smaller with her in it, the air heavy and suffocating. As they drove on, Mark noticed something odd. The rain was falling harder than ever, yet the woman's dress was completely dry now. He tried to make small talk, but she remained silent, her face expressionless. Then he realized something that made his blood run cold. Her feet. They didn't touch the floor. Before he could process what he was seeing, the headlights flickered, plunging the car into darkness for a split second. When they came back on, the woman was gone. Mark slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding. He turned to the passenger seat. Empty. Charlie barked frantically, his eyes fixed on the rear windshield. Mark followed his gaze and froze. The woman was standing in the middle of the road, her head tilted at an impossible angle, her eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "Drive," Mark whispered to himself, slamming his foot on the gas. The car surged forward, and the woman disappeared into the rearview mirror. Mark's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing. Minutes passed in tense silence, and the rain began to lighten. Mark let out a shaky breath, glancing at Charlie. The dog had calmed down, but still stared at the back seat, his ears flattened. Mark's phone buzzed on the dashboard, startling him. He picked it up, grateful for a distraction. It was a text from his mother. "Be careful on the road tonight. There's been an accident near Old Pine Road. A woman was killed there last week. People say her spirit's been seen trying to hitch rides. Don't stop for anyone." Mark's stomach dropped. He glanced at the passenger seat again, half expecting her to be there. It was still empty. But when he looked back at the road, his breath caught in his throat. She was standing there again, directly in his path. This time, she smiled. The storm was relentless as Jason navigated his way through the winding mountain road. The GPS on his dashboard flickered, struggling to keep up with the poor signal. It had directed him off the main highway an hour ago, promising a shortcut through the woods. Now, the narrow road seemed endless, and the trees loomed closer with every turn. The rain was so heavy it felt like his windshield wipers were doing nothing. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel, trying to focus. He hadn't seen another car in miles, and the isolation was beginning to gnaw at him. The first sign of trouble came when his headlights caught a rusted old sign leaning precariously by the side of the road. "Welcome to Black Hollow, population 213. Jason frowned. That name didn't ring a bell. The GPS hadn't mentioned any towns. He drove on, but the road became worse. Potholes, cracks, and sections of broken asphalt made him slow to a crawl. The trees seemed even denser now, their branches clawing at the car as the wind picked up. The forest was unnaturally dark, as if the rainstorm had sucked all light from the sky. Then, just as he rounded a sharp bend, he saw it. A gas station, its dim neon sign flickering, stood alone in the middle of the forest. It looked old, abandoned, but a faint light glowed inside the office. Jason's gas gauge was dangerously low. He had no choice but to stop. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, shaking rain off his jacket. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and old oil. A man sat behind the counter, his face obscured by the shadows. "Evenin'," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. Evening, Jason replied, forcing a smile. I'm running low on gas. Can I fill up? The man didn't move, didn't even nod, his pale eyes fixed on Jason. You lost? He asked, ignoring the question. Jason hesitated. No, just passing through. The man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Nobody just passes through Black Hollow. Jason's unease deepened. He glanced around the station, noting the outdated posters on the walls and the thick layer of dust on the shelves. Well, I just need enough gas to get me back on the highway, he said, keeping his tone light. The man finally stood, his movements slow and deliberate. He was tall and gaunt, his skin stretched thin over his cheekbones. Pumps outside, he said, pointing a long, bony finger. Jason nodded, eager to leave the unsettling atmosphere. He headed back out into the rain and began filling his tank. That's when he noticed the graveyard. It was barely visible behind the station, the headstones crooked and weathered with age. Jason shivered, telling himself it was just the cold. The pump clicked, signaling a full tank. As Jason replaced the nozzle, he heard a faint noise, like whispering. He froze, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, more distinct, and Jason realized it was coming from the woods. He turned, squinting into the darkness. Shadows moved between the trees, too quick to be animals. Hey, he called, his voice wavering. The whispering stopped. Jason backed toward his car, his heart pounding. Just as he reached for the door handle, the neon sign above the station flickered violently, truly casting the entire area into darkness. The whispering returned, louder now, surrounding him. Jason spun around, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The shadows in the woods had grown closer, taking shape. Figures, dozens of them, emerged from the trees. Their faces were pale and featureless, their limbs unnaturally long. They moved silently, their hollow eyes fixed on him. Jason fumbled with his car keys, dropping them into the mud. He cursed, dropping to his knees to grab them. When he stood, one of the figures was mere feet away. It tilted its head, its blank face somehow exuding malice. Jason threw himself into the car and locked the doors. The figures surrounded the vehicle, their hands pressing against the windows, leaving black smears wherever they touched. He turned the key, and the engine roared to life. Without a second thought, he floored the gas pedal, plowing through the figures. They didn't move or flinch, just dissolved into the mist as the car sped forward. The road seemed endless, the rain blurring his vision. The GPS was useless now, its screen blank. Jason kept driving, his eyes darting to the mirrors. The figures were still following. No matter how fast he drove, they kept pace, their forms stretching and twisting as they moved. Finally, after what felt like hours, Jason saw lights ahead, a highway. Relief washed over him as he merged onto the familiar road for Bamagrai, leaving the forest behind. But as he glanced in the rearview mirror, his blood ran cold. A single figure sat in his back seat, its featureless face turned toward him. "Where are you going?" it whispered. The sign on the side of the highway was old, its paint faded and peeling, but the words were still legible. Next rest area, 10 miles. Holly exhaled in relief. She'd been driving for hours through the desolate Midwest, and the coffee she'd guzzled earlier was catching up with her. The rest stop couldn't come soon enough. The road ahead stretched into darkness, illuminated only by her high beams. The landscape was flat, empty, and eerie in the dead of night. No cars passed her, and the radio had long since descended into static. She felt utterly alone, the kind of solitude that burrowed deep into her chest and made her feel small. When she finally spotted the glow of fluorescent lights in the distance, it felt like a beacon of salvation. Holly pulled into the rest stop, noting that it was deserted. A single flickering street lamp cast a sickly yellow light over the parking lot, and the small building housing the bathrooms and vending machines looked uninviting. Still, nature called. She parked her car close to the entrance and stepped out, shivering as the cold air bit at her skin. The wind carried an odd smell, something faintly metallic like rust. The rest stop was silent, the kind of silence that seemed too heavy, too deliberate. Holly wrinkled her nose at the smell, a mix of mildew and something else she couldn't place. The bathroom door creaked loudly as she pushed it open. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the cracked tiles. There were 3 stalls, all with their doors ajar, and a long mirror above the sinks. "Get in and get out," she muttered to herself, stepping into the nearest stall. As she finished and reached for the latch, she heard it. A faint sound, like footsteps. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The footsteps stopped, replaced by the faint creak of a stall door further down. Holly peered under the stalls but saw no feet. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. Heart pounding, she opened her stall door cautiously. The bathroom was empty. She laughed nervously, shaking her head. "Get a grip, Holly." She moved to the sink to wash her hands, avoiding her reflection in the mirror. Something about looking at herself in this place felt wrong. The lights flickered. When they came back on, Holly finally glanced up. Her reflection was smiling. She wasn't. Holly stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. Her reflection tilted its head, the smile stretching wider and wider until it was unnatural, grotesque. Then it moved. Holly's breath caught as her reflection stepped out of the mirror, its movements jerky and wrong. It towered over her now, its features distorting, its eyes black voids. She bolted for the door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. The creature lunged at her, its long fingers clawing at her hair, dragging her backward. Holly screamed, kicking and thrashing, but it was no use. The lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness. When they came back on, the bathroom was empty. Outside, Holly's car sat idling, the driver's seat empty. But in the rearview mirror, a wide, unnatural smile lingered, watching the road ahead. The clock on James' dashboard read 2:13 a.m. as he drove down the desolate stretch of Route 6. The road was infamous, known locally as the Devil's Curve, a winding, narrow strip flanked by steep cliffs on one side and dense, ancient forest on the other. James had heard the stories, but he didn't believe in curses or hauntings. He was just trying to make it to his sister's house before dawn. The highway was eerily empty, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. His headlights barely pierced the heavy fog that clung to the ground like a living thing. Then he saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road. James slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a halt. His heart pounded as the figure, a young woman dressed in a tattered red dress, turned to face him. Her hair was a tangled mess, her face pale and streaked with dirt. She raised a hand, motioning for him to lower his window. James hesitated. Every instinct told him to drive, to leave her there and not look back. But something about her expression, a mix of fear and desperation, compelled him to stop. He rolled down the window just enough to speak. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She nodded, her voice trembling. "Please, I need a ride. He's coming." James frowned. "Who's coming?" Her eyes darted to the forest behind her, wide with terror. "Please," she whispered. Against his better judgment, James unlocked the door. The woman climbed into the passenger seat, her hands shaking as she clutched a small, dirty backpack to her chest. James tried to keep his voice calm. "What's your name?" "Claire," she said, staring straight ahead. He merged back onto the road, glancing at her occasionally. She looked over her shoulder repeatedly, as if expecting someone or something to be following them. "Do you want me to take you to the police?" he asked. Claire shook her head violently. "No police. Just drive, please." The way she said it made his skin crawl. Minutes passed in tense silence. The fog seemed thicker now, swirling like smoke. James adjusted his rearview mirror and froze. There was something on the road behind them. At first, it was just a dark shape, distant and formless. But as he squinted, the shape resolved into a tall, shadowy figure walking down the middle of the highway. Its gait was unnaturally slow, but it was gaining on them, closing the gap despite James's increasing speed. "What the hell?" he muttered, his grip tightening on the wheel. Claire turned, saw it, and let out a choked sob. "Faster! You have to go faster!" James didn't need to be told twice. He floored the gas, the engine roaring as the car sped through the fog. But no matter how fast they went, the figure stayed with them, its dark form growing clearer with every glance. It was massive, its limbs elongated and distorted, its face hidden in shadow. But the eyes, two glowing crimson orbs, burned through the fog, locking onto the car. "What is that?" James shouted. Claire's voice cracked as she answered. "It's him. He doesn't stop. He never stops." James' mind raced. He had no idea what he was or why Claire was so terrified, but he knew they couldn't outrun it. The car's engine began to sputter and the headlights flickered. "No, no, no," James yelled, slamming the dashboard. The car slowed, despite his foot pressing the gas to the floor. The figure was now directly behind them. Its hand, long and clawed, reached out and dragged across the back of the car with a sound like nails on metal. "Get out!" Claire screamed. James didn't argue. He threw the car into park and bolted, pulling Claire with him. They ran into the woods, the branches scratching their faces and tearing at their clothes. Behind them, the figure followed, its movements impossibly smooth, as if it were gliding. James tripped over a root, crashing to the ground. Claire yanked him to his feet, but it was too late. The figure was upon them. Its face was still obscured, but James could feel its gaze, cold and malevolent. It raised a hand, and the forest seemed to darken, the air thick with the smell of sulfur. Then Claire did something unexpected. She stepped forward, dropping her backpack to the ground. "Take me," she whispered. "No!" James yelled, grabbing her arm, but she pulled away. "It's me he wants," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Run. Don't look back." Before James could protest, the figure enveloped her in its shadow. Her screams echoed through the woods, and then there was silence. James ran, his legs burning, his chest heaving. He didn't stop till he burst out of the forest and onto the highway. A trucker found him hours later, wandering along the road in a daze. When the police arrived, James told them everything. They found his car, its doors ripped off and the back scratched with deep gouges. But there was no sign of Claire. Later, James learned that Claire's name didn't appear on any missing persons reports. There was no record of anyone matching her description in the area. But every so often on foggy nights along Route 6, drivers report seeing a young woman in a red dress, standing alone in the middle of the road. And if they stop to help, they never make it out of the woods. The moon hung low and full over a desolate stretch of highway that cut through miles of barren desert. Sarah had been driving for hours, her eyelids heavy as the clock ticked past 1 a.m. She was heading home from a weekend with friends, the laughter and warmth of their company now a distant memory in the oppressive stillness of the night. Her gas tank hovered just above empty, and she hadn't seen a station in what felt like forever. Her phone had no signal, teeny, and the only sound was the steady hum of her car's engine. As she rounded a curve, her headlights illuminated a solitary figure, walking along the roadside. A man, tall and gaunt, his face obscured by the brim of a wide-brimmed hat. He wore an old-fashioned suit, the kind you'd expect to see in photographs from a century ago. He turned as she passed, his face catching the light for just a moment. Sarah felt a chill race down her spine. His eyes were black. Not just dark, but completely devoid of color, like twin voids that seemed to swallow the light. Her heart raced as she glanced in the rearview mirror. The man had stopped walking and now stood perfectly still, watching her car disappear down the road. Shaking off the unease, Sarah told herself she was just tired, her mind playing tricks on her. But a few miles later, her headlights revealed the same man, standing in the middle of the road. She slammed on the brakes, her car skidding to a halt just feet from him. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, his head tilted slightly as if studying her. Sarah honked the horn, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. "Get out of the road," she yelled, though the windows were closed. The man raised a hand, pointing to the side of the road. At first, Sarah thought he was signaling her to pull over, but then she saw what he was pointing at. A gas station. She hadn't noticed it before, and she was sure it hadn't been there when she drove this road earlier. The lights flickered weakly, and the pumps looked ancient, but the neon open sign glowed steadily. Desperation won out over fear. She needed gas, and this was her only option. She pulled into the station, her tires crunching over the gravel. The man was gone. The station was eerily quiet, the desert wind the only sound. Sarah stepped out of her car, the air cold and dry against her skin. The pumps didn't look like they belonged to this century, rusted, with cracked glass over the dials. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing into the stillness. A door creaked open, and an elderly attendant stepped out. His skin was sallow, his eyes sunken, and his movements unnaturally stiff. "Need gas?" he asked, his voice a rasp. "Yes," Sarah said, her voice unsteady. "How much?" He didn't answer, just nodded toward the pump. She took it as permission and started to fill her tank, keeping one eye on the attendant, who had retreated into the shadows of the station's overhang. As the tank filled, Sarah noticed something carved into the pump's metal. "Leave before he comes." Her stomach nodded. "Hey, what does this mean?" she asked, but the attendant was gone. She spun around, scanning the darkness, and froze. The man with the black eyes was standing at the edge of the lot, his wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his face. Sarah dropped the nozzle and scrambled into her car, her heart pounding. She turned the key and the engine roared to life. As she sped out of the station, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The man didn't follow. Relief flooded her, but it was short-lived. A few miles down the road, her headlights caught something ahead, a figure walking. It was him. Sarah's breath hitched as the man turned to face her car, his eyes glinting like polished obsidian. She pressed the gas pedal harder, determined to fly past him, but as she drew closer, the man disappeared. No sound, no movement, just gone. The car shuddered violently, and Sarah screamed as the steering wheel jerked in her hands. The headlights flickered, the engine sputtering as if something was gripping the car. And then she saw it, in the passenger seat. The man sat there, his black eyes boring into her, his mouth twisted into a grin that stretched too wide, too unnatural. "Keep driving," he said, his voice low and hollow. Sarah's scream echoed into the empty desert as the car careened off the road. The next morning, a trucker found her car abandoned by the highway. The driver's seat was empty, but the passenger door hung open, as if someone had calmly stepped out into the night. No one ever saw Sarah again, but locals swear they sometimes see her car driving Route 6, its headlights flickering, with a figure in a wide-brimmed hat sitting in the passenger's seat.